Hello, my name is Jordan Yvon-Moreau, and we're going to be going into some specifics on Metissage research. So, we'll examine the research context that we'll be speaking to, Indigenous research frameworks, get into the background of Metissage, how this would work with research data and data collection, show some specific examples of Metissage research, and finally a reflection on if Metissage research will have a play in my own methodologies. So there's a bit of a critical theoretical approach here. As Hostetler states, the role of solid research is not merely connected to our procedures, but to serve people's well-being. To make another connection, Mackenzie and Knipe discuss constructivist approaches to research, which have the intention of understanding, quote, the world of human experience, suggesting that reality is socially constructed. So, to the constructivist researcher, we tend to rely upon a participant's view of a situation being studied, and this recognizes the impact on the researcher has on their own background and experience. Methodologically speaking, then, based on our interactions between and among the participants, a consensus is sought in the findings, and later we'll connect how this connects to an indigenous way of decision making. So, for my own research context, I'm hoping to examine the use of indigenous strength-based symbols to initiate more effective, culturally appropriate ways to organize student-specific planning meetings. Here we see the circle of courage, which takes the values of generosity, belonging, independence, and mastery, and stresses that all children need to fulfill these needs and values for positive self-development. The idea is to apply these to schools, and then we would question whether our schooling environments support these values for our students. I suppose then I am admittedly categorizing Metissage as a cousin or connector to Indigenous research methodology. Ermine goes on to say that the specific orientations of transformation are skills that promote personal and social transformation, a vision of social change that leads to harmony with, rather than control over the environment, and the attribution of a spiritual dimension to the environment. In their work on barriers and working with an Indigenous community, Madden, Higgins, and Kortreg cite Indigenous elders and support workers who speak to the challenges faced when trying to fit Indigenous knowledge, systems, and ways into the larger educational framework. It seems we have a deficiency in knowing whether Indigenous methods for supporting student success would be of more success, since there's little work that has reflected this practice. Brophy furthers this work by commenting on a mistrust from Indigenous communities towards the research process, as previous researchers have not actively given back to the community. This too does not respect Indigenous methods or ways of knowing. An Indigenous researcher is how we can build this research while establishing the relationships with this community. Here it will be noted that while the specific symbols or practices are Indigenous based, that the hope would be to use these techniques for any student, regardless of cultural background, though the planning for Indigenous students would maintain consideration as it relates to this work. So if Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, we must also include this in our research as well, and how we bring this research into communities. So in examining the background of Metissage, academics state that it arose out of a desire to find a way to escape from colonial logics. It's a form of inquiry that retraces the divides, and it pays attention to how story is a way to relay and connect to people. To begin with, the word Métis traditionally has been used to refer to people of mixed First Nations and European descent, historically associated with this northwest central part of Canada. It's at times now been expanded to include all people of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry. The word métissage indeed comes from this word métis, which also has Latin and Greek origins. Its Latin origin, mixtus, means mixed, and refers to the cloth that is woven from two different fibers. So Dr. Dwayne Donald, he's described the emergence of a type of métissage that results in an unfolding rapprochement or growing harmony between cultures and peoples usually considered at odds with one another. The symbol of braiding has been used by many researchers of métissage as a way to envision this weaving together of strands. Metissage can be explored as one solution to address some of the challenges that Indigenous researchers face, because it does offer a basic framework for creating an Indigenous research design that enables each researcher to explore and then center their personal and community values and beliefs. So this arose as a sensibility, as a way to describe the culture that developed. It honors Indigenous sensibilities, and it rethinks our connections, relationships, and using a story. Question is, how do we do that? So how does Metissage work within a research and data collection? Metissage focuses on how story honors the spirit in a way that enhances a relationship to decolonize, emphasize the connectivity of different stories rather than competing. This is inspired by Plains Cree and Blackfoot sensibilities that understand story as a form of thought. So through Metissage, we attempt to recreate the world through story, to bring those sensibilities to research practice, and if we want to create a difference, we have to create a different story. It's largely seen as a textual practice. We're going to focus on the two main forms of Metissage, which is collective Metissage and Indigenous Metissage. To start with Indigenous Metissage, that tends to focus on an artifact, and the process is a way of looking at a living part of this culture and the stories that remain from an artifact and the exploration of such. Metissage in general is an opening of an inquiry, and it focuses on the relationality, colonial legacies, and those competing realities. So Indigenous Metissage researchers really get into the story of the artifacts, of the peoples and places. We're going to use the two murals in the library at the University of Alberta as a bit of an example here. This first one, titled The History of Alberta, sits in opposition to Alex Janvier's Sky Talk. And when we're looking at those competing ideologies or competing space, what Indigenous Métis researcher would be concerned with would be that space between. How can we see these two beliefs simultaneously in order to understand this space, in order to answer the question of where is here? This framework arose out of a desire to find a way to escape from those colonial logic and to form an inquiry that retraces the divides, thus transforming our knowledge of what we know. So in looking at collective métissage, collective is indeed a group that works together in research. And the group brings together their own text, their own music, their own images, artifacts. And the idea is to bring these forward and use this as our data. The process is also part of the data. The questions listed here would be ones, as per Dr. Dwayne Donald, these would be the questions that the collective would explore. And this would be the process of métissage. So the collective often comes back together and tries to braid together their own process from what was collected. This is then presented often in written work, through stanzas as an example. Each stanza is asking the listener to connect the dots. And if it can be hard to discern the message, then this is indeed part of the intent of métissage. Often this work is presented to make curricular connections with social studies, English, but there's even a push to connecting Indigenous research with scientific ways of knowing, and it would be, I think, an interesting step to examine how we can approach this this process and this data work in science as well. So we're going to examine a few examples of Metissage research, specifically looking at how Metissage research has been communicated and used in academic peer-reviewed journals. So one example, S. Burke did a dissertation of her research explored the concept of cognitive dissonance in social work practice, largely involved in interviewing Métis, First Nations, and non-Indigenous social workers in BC. But she used a Metissage framework in presenting her research, and this provided a means to conceptualize Indigenous and Western knowledge side by side. As she describes, it was important to be able to use qualitative methods in the data collection, but at the same time, she wanted to make sure that she was guided by her beliefs as a Métis woman. As another example, Rihanna Robinson also used a Metissage conceptual framework, and she mainly used this to analyze and present the findings of her research. As she described, she conducted semi-structured interviews with institutional leaders, elders, students, staff, and instructors in BC, and she aligned those findings in thematic categories. And these were symbolized by the Metissage colors, red, green, blue, white, and black, of the Métis sash. So here's an excerpt from a collective Metissage project that was written out as part of a research journal. The work by Charette et al., this was work of a collective who sought to examine and improve teaching practices by using Metissage literacy practices. And then they then presented their findings as Metissage text. And if you can see from this example, the research findings is presented in a descriptive, poetic, and at times very impactful way. So, how and will Metissage research play into my own research practices? First off, I think there are some limitations associated with using Metissage as a research framework. For one, the limitation is that there's been little written about its use as a research praxis. As Dr. Donald mentioned, it's something that needs to be experienced, processed, rather than written about. Another limitation would be that there are few academics who seem to know about Metissage, and it could be difficult for academics to understand the tenets of Metissage and why and how it could be used as a reliable research framework. And yet, I would imagine this all sounds fairly loose for researchers, but considering the relationship building capacities, the reciprocity given towards participants, that we can't discount stories as a form of data collection, and that the intention of Metissage is to recreate the world through stories, I believe there's a way to apply this sensibility to our research practice. Indeed, data is a problematic term, and yet should we still be able to use process as part of our data? As Dr. Donald mentioned, do we need to theorize what we do, or do we need to do what we do? And Metissage, most of what's contributed is understanding our network of relations, which would have beneficial implications for working with students in a research capacity. Still, I would need a mentorship if undergoing this type of process, as it hasn't been something I've used before. And finally, I feel this is a way of looking at how Indigenous identities and knowledge can be incorporated in academic research in a way that is validated and accepted as legitimate and worthy.